The first watch. The scent of pine sap, damp earth, and boundless space. That was the smell of home for Ranger Alara Vance. After a decade with the National Park Service, the sprawling expanse of Blackwood National Park was more familiar to her than the city she'd grown up in. She knew its sun-dappled trails, its secret waterfalls, and the quiet dignity of its ancient trees. She also knew its dangers, the sudden squalls, the temperamental wildlife, the sheer, disorienting scale of it that could swallow a person whole. Most new rangers learn the hard way. Ilara's current partner, a fresh-faced recruit named Ben, was no exception. He was eager, bright, and still believed the uniform was a shield against the unknown. Their cruiser, a green SUV with the Park Service arrowhead on the door, was parked at the overlook, its engine ticking as it cooled. The vista before them was a breathtaking carpet of endless green, fading to blue haze in the distance. The last of the sunset painted the sky in streaks of orange and purple. "Another quiet one," Ben said, sipping from his thermos of coffee. "I thought for sure we'd have to wrangle some campers trying to feed the bears at Site 7. "Quiet is good," Ilara replied, her eyes scanning the darkening tree line below. "Quiet means everyone's safe. It's when the quiet breaks that you need to worry." Ben chuckled. "You sound like my training sergeant, always waiting for the other shoe to drop." Ilara offered a small smile, but didn't take her eyes off the forest. She wasn't waiting for a shoe. She was listening for a change in the rhythm of the woods. A decade in, you developed a sixth sense. You learned the park's normal sounds, the chatter of squirrels, the sigh of the wind of the pines, the distant hoot of an owl. It was a silence within the silence that set her teeth on edge. The radio on the dash crackled to life, shattering the peace. "Dispatch to Unit 4. Ilara, you copy?" Ilara picked up the handset. "Unit 4, go ahead, Marie." The dispatcher's voice was calm, but carried an edge. "Asterisk, we've got a missing person report. Hiker on the Whispering Pine Trail. Male, mid-20s, named Daniel Shaw. Was supposed to check in with his family 6 hours ago. His vehicle is still at the trailhead." Asterisk. Ilara felt a familiar cold knot form in her stomach. The Whispering Pine Trail. It wasn't the longest or the most difficult, but it cut through some of the oldest, most isolated parts of the park. It was also steeped in ranger lore. New recruits called it the Vanishing Trail. Old-timers just got quiet when it was mentioned. "Copy that, Marie. We're en route to the Whispering Pine Trailhead now. ETA 10 minutes. She started the engine and flipped on the headlights, punching the gas before Ben had even secured his thermos. "Whispering Pine, huh?" Ben said, buckling his seatbelt as the SUV lurched onto gravel road. "That's the one with the spooky stories, right? The one the loggers abandoned 100 years ago because they said the trees were talking to them." "They didn't abandon it," Ilara corrected. Her tone clipped as she navigated the winding road. "The company went bankrupt. The stories are just campfire tales to scare kids." "Right, because the trees are definitely not whispering," Ben said, a hint of mock seriousness in his voice. Ilara didn't answer. She'd never heard trees whisper, but she had heard things. Things that couldn't be explained by wind or wildlife. On still nights near the old logging cuts, sounds sometimes carried in strange ways, warped and distorted until they became something else entirely. They reached the trailhead. A single, beat-up sedan sat alone in the parking area. The forest beyond the informational kiosk was a wall of impenetrable blackness. Ilara and Ben geared up. Headlamps, radios, first aid kits, and a pack with emergency supplies. The air was chillier here, the temperature dropping significantly the moment they stepped onto the packed earth of the trail. Daniel Shaw. Ben's voice echoed through the trees, swallowed almost instantly by the dense foliage. "Park Ranger. Call out if you can hear us." They walked in silence for a few minutes, listening. The normal night sounds were there, but they felt muted, hesitant. "It's different out here at night, isn't it?" Ben whispered, his bravado beginning to crack. "The park, it feels older." "It is older," Ilara said softly. "We're just visitors." They continued their sweep, their headlamp beams carving shaky tunnels of light in the overwhelming dark. Every shadow looked like a crouching figure. Every gnarled root looked like a bone. After an hour of fruitless calling, Elara stopped. Hold up. Ben froze. What? What is it? Elara tilted her head, listening. Do you hear that? Ben was silent for a moment. I don't hear anything. Exactly. The woods had gone utterly silent. The crickets, the frogs, the rustling in the underbrush, it had all ceased. The only sound was a low thrum of blood in their own ears. It was a silence within the silence. And then another sound, faint, distant. It was a voice. It was too far away to make out words, but it had the cadence of a human voice calling out. It was coming from further down the trail, deeper into the heart of the old growth. Daniel, Ben yelled, his voice sharp with hope. Daniel Shaw. They listened. The voice called back. It was clearer now, but the word was wrong. It wasn't hello or over here. It was a single, drawn-out syllable that didn't form any word Elara knew. It sounded like join. That's not right, Ben said, his earlier fear returning full force. It could be an echo, or he could be disoriented, hurt, Elara said, though her own instincts were screaming in protest. We have to check it out. They moved faster now, following the occasional, chilling call. It never got louder, never clearer. It was always just ahead, just around the next bend, beckoning them deeper. The trail began to change, the well-maintained path giving way to rougher, less traveled ground. They were entering the area of the old logging cuts. Elara stopped again, shining her light on a tree beside the trail. Carved into bark, fresh and oozing sap, was a series of lines. They weren't letters. They were jagged, frantic marks, like someone had tried to scratch their way through the wood. What the hell is that? Ben breathed. Elara didn't answer. She was looking past him, her beam fixed on a figure standing between the trees 20 yards off the trail. It was tall and impossibly thin, its outline blurred in the darkness. For a heart-stopping second, she thought it was a person, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too narrow, its limbs at angles that seemed unnatural. Hello, Elara called out, her voice tighter than she intended. Park ranger. Identify yourself. The figure didn't move. It didn't make a sound. Ben followed her gaze. Oh, God, what is that? As they watched, the figure seemed to fragment. It dissolved back into the shadows, becoming nothing more than a pattern of vertical trunks and darkness. There was no sound of footsteps, no rustle of movement. It was just gone. The voice called out again, this time from directly behind them. Join us. They spun around, lights sweeping wildly. There was nothing there. The radio on Alara's hip crackled, making them both jump. Marie's voice was laced with static. Unit 4, be advised we have on the thermal cam, multiple heat signatures, your position, surrounding. The transmission broke up into a wash of white noise. Dispatch, repeat. Marie, say again. Elara shouted into the handset. Only static answered. The woods were dead silent once more. The voice had stopped. The thing between the trees was gone. They were alone in a circle of light, surrounded by a silent, watchful darkness that felt like it was holding its breath. Ben was hyperventilating, his eyes wide with pure terror. Elara, what do we do? Elara Vance, a 10-year veteran who knew every inch of her park, realized with a cold, dawning horror that she was lost. The trail behind them looked unfamiliar. The trees seemed to have closed ranks. The map in her head had been redrawn by an unseen hand. She looked at her young partner's terrified face, then out into the hungry dark. We don't move, she said, her voice a low whisper. We wait for the sun. And in the silence that followed, she heard it. Not a voice, not a whisper, but a soft, slow, scraping sound, like a branch or a bone being dragged across the bark of a tree. It was close, and it was circling them. What the woods took, the scraping sound was a metronome of terror, marking time in the suffocating dark. It circled them, never coming closer, never fading away. It was a sound that felt ancient, patient, and utterly deliberate. Elara's training screamed at her to move, to act, to break the siege. But a deeper, primal instinct held her frozen. This was not a bear or a lost hiker. This was a predator that used sound and shadow as its weapons. To move was to enter its territory on its terms. Ben was a statue of fear beside her, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps that fog in the chill air. His hand was clenched white around the grip of his bear spray, his knuckles pressing hard against the back of Alara's arm. She could feel the fine tremor running through his entire body. "Alara," he whimpered, his voice barely a whisper. "Don't speak," she breathed back, her own voice low and steady, a forced calm she did not feel. "Don't move. Just listen." She strained her ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the scraping. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a product of the trees themselves. It was a dry, rasping drag, like a heavy sack being pulled over rough bark. The image of the thin, impossibly tall figure flashed in her mind, and she imagined its long, bony limbs scraping against the pines as it moved. The radio on her hip hissed with a sudden burst of static, making them both flinch. A voice, shredded and distorted, fought its way through the noise. "Anyone see it? The cameras? God, the trees?" It was Marie, but her professional composure was gone, replaced by raw, undiluted panic. Then the transmission died, leaving a silence that was somehow worse than the scraping. The woods had swallowed their lifeline. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The cold seeped through their uniforms, and the darkness pressed in a physical weight. The scraping continued its lazy, circling rhythm. It was studying them, testing them. Then it changed. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was heavier, more menacing than the sound itself. It was the pause before the strike. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. She slowly, infinitesimally, turned her head, scanning the blackness beyond the pathetic circle of light. Nothing. A new sound began. A whisper. It wasn't the wind. It was a sibilant, multi-throated hiss that seemed to rise from the ground and fall from the branches simultaneously. It was a sound of dry leaves skittering across stone, of many voices speaking just below the threshold of hearing. It wove through the trees, a chorus of secrets they were not meant to know. "Lust! A loon! Stay!" The words were layered, overlapping, a toxic whisper that slithered into their ears. Ben let out a choked sob, clapping his hands over the sides of his head. "Make it stop," he moaned. "Make it stop." Alara felt the whispers crawling inside her skull, probing at her fears, her memories. They found her deepest anxiety, the suffocating fear of being truly, hopelessly lost that every ranger buries deep down, and they fed on it. "No one will find you. The map is gone. You are ours now." "No." Alara growled through clenched teeth, fighting the psychic assault. She focused on the tactile, the cold metal of her flashlight, the rough fabric of her uniform, the solid ground beneath her boots. She was Ranger Alara Vance. This was her park. A flicker of movement to her left. She snapped her light toward it. The thin figure was back. It stood between two massive pine trees, closer this time. Its form was still indistinct, a man-shaped void that seemed to drink the light from her beam. The whispers grew louder, more excited, swirling around the figure like flies. It took a step forward. Its movement was all wrong. It didn't walk so much as unfold, its limbs moving in a series of jerky, elongated extensions. It didn't crack a single twig. Ben saw it. A strangled scream escaped his lips, and his training shattered completely. Panic overrode every instinct. "Get away!" he shrieked, and he bolted. He didn't run down the trail. He ran blindly away from the figure, crashing through the underbrush, deeper into the waiting dark. "Ben and oh!" Alara screamed, but it was too late. The moment he broke the circle of light, the woods erupted. The whispering became a shrieking cacophony. The scraping sound returned, furious and fast, moving after him. The tall figure dissolved into shadows, giving chase without moving. Alara stood frozen for a split second, a war raging inside her. Protocol said never to separate. Her instinct said to go after her partner. The terrifying, intelligent malice in the air said it was a trap, and Ben was the bait. Cursing, she chose her partner. She plunged into darkness after him, her headlamp beam bouncing wildly as she crashed through branches and stumbled over roots. She could hear Ben's frantic progress ahead, a storm of panic and breaking twigs. "Ben, stop, right now. That's an order," she yelled, her voice raw. His only answer was a scream. It was short, sharp, and cut off with a horrifying suddenness. The woods went silent again. The whispers stopped. The scraping stopped. The only sound was Alara's own ragged breathing and the thump of her heart in her ears. "Ben," she called out, her voice small and terrified. "Ben, answer me." Nothing. She moved forward more slowly now, her flashlight beam trembling as she swept it across the forest floor. She found the signs of his flight. A torn piece of fabric from his uniform jacket snagged on a thorn bush, a deep footprint in a patch of soft earth. Then she found his radio, crushed as if in a powerful vice. A few steps further, she found his flashlight, the lens shattered. Her own light caught on something pale ahead. It was Ben's hand, jutting from behind a large spruce tree. He was lying on the ground. "Ben!" she cried, rushing forward and skidding to her knees beside him. He was alive. His eyes were open, wide with a terror so absolute it looked like madness. He was breathing in shallow, rapid gasps, but he made no sound. He was catatonic with shock. There were no visible wounds, no blood, but his uniform was covered in a fine layer of black soil and decaying pine needles, as if he'd been rolled on the forest floor. "Ben, it's me. It's Alara. Look at me." She cradled his head, checking for a concussion. He didn't seem to see her. His eyes were fixed on the canopy above, staring at nothing. As she leaned over him, her light illuminated the trunk of the spruce tree he lay beneath. Carved into the bark, fresh and dripping with sap, was a new symbol. It wasn't the frantic scratches from before. This one was more complex, more deliberate. It looked like a spiral or a vortex, with jagged lines radiating from its center. It made her feel dizzy and nauseous to look at it. And then the whisper came again. It wasn't a chorus this time. It was a single voice, dry and rasping like dead leaves, and it seemed to come from right behind her ear. "We gave him back." Alara spun around, shining her light into the emptiness. There was nothing there. When she looked back at the tree, the symbol was gone. In its place was only smooth, unbroken bark. A groan came from Ben. His eyes fluttered, and for a second, focus returned. He looked at her, and a single, clear tear traced a path through the dirt on his cheek. His lips moved, forming a silent word. "Eyes!" Then the focus was gone, replaced once more by vacant, abject terror. The journey back to the trail was a blur of sheer willpower. Half dragging, half carrying Ben's dead weight, Alara stumbled through the woods, expecting the whispers or the scraping to return at any moment. They didn't. The forest was just a forest again. The normal night sounds, the crickets, the frogs, tentatively resumed. She found the trail not 50 yards from where they'd been standing. It had been there the whole time. It took an hour to get Ben to the cruiser. She radioed for an ambulance. Her reporter clipped, "Professional lie about a sudden psychotic episode, a disoriented run into the woods, a fall and a head injury." She couldn't say the truth. Who would believe her? As the ambulance sped away, its light staining the trees red and blue, Senior Ranger Phil Mackey arrived. He was a man in his late 50s, with a face weathered by sun and 1,000 unsolved problems. He listened to her sanitized report in silence, his eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, he just nodded slowly and looked out toward the dark mouth of the Whispering Pine Trail. "The hiker's pack was found an hour ago," he said, his voice gravelly and low. "Ripped to shreds. No blood, no sign of a struggle. Just shredded. And his camera..." Phil paused, choosing his words carefully. The last photo on the memory card was a selfie. He's smiling. And right behind him, between the trees, the lens is blurry, distorted, but you can make out something tall and thin. He finally turned to look at her, his eyes holding a deep, weary knowledge. The woods give and the woods take, Alara. Sometimes they just take a piece. Sometimes they take it all. Consider yourself and your partner lucky. You were given back. He got in his truck and drove away, leaving Alara alone in the parking lot. She looked down at her own hands. They were clean, but tucked into the cuff of her uniform pants, she found a single long, dry pine needle. It hadn't been there before, and she knew, with a cold certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the woods hadn't finished with her. A transaction had been made. Ben had been returned, but his mind was the price, and she had been marked. The whispers knew her name. The unquiet earth. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and despair. A stark, fluorescent-lit universe away from the damp, organic darkness of Blackwood. Ilera sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair beside Ben's bed, watching the steady, green blink of his heart monitor. It was the only thing about him that seemed familiar. He'd been sedated. The doctors called it catatonic agitation. When the sedatives wore off, he would thrash and whimper, his eyes wide with terror. So profound was a physical presence in the room. He would claw at his own face, his nails leaving red trails on his skin, until orderlies restrained him. He didn't speak. He only sometimes made a sound, a dry, rasping scrape in the back of his throat that made the nurses flinch and Ilera's blood run cold. It was the sound of dragging. She'd given her official statement a dozen times. A fall, a head injury, a traumatic, psychological episode. She stuck to the story with the rigid discipline of a soldier, but the lies felt like ash in her mouth. Senior Ranger Mackey had backed her up without question. His silence a louder confirmation of the truth than any scream could be. The woods give, and the woods take, he'd muttered to her in the hallway outside Ben's room. He looked older, the lines on his face etched deeper. They took his mind. Ilera, be glad they didn't take his body. Or yours. Were they, Phil? She'd asked, her voice barely a whisper, desperate for any anchor in this new, horrifying reality. He'd just shaken his head, his eyes distant. Things that were here before us. Things that remember when the trees were old gods and the dark wasn't something you could push back with a flashlight. They sleep most of the time. But sometimes something wakes them up. A disrespectful camper. A lost soul. Or just a bad night. He'd placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. Don't go looking for answers. You won't like what finds you first. Now, alone with the beeping machines and Ben's haunted silence, his warning echoed in her mind. Don't go looking. But how could she not? The guilt was a parasite, feeding on her. She was a senior ranger. She was responsible. She had led him out there. She had frozen when she should have acted. She leaned forward, her voice a soft murmur. Ben, it's Ilera. Can you hear me? His eyes, open and unblinking, stared at the acoustic tile ceiling. They didn't move. I'm so sorry, she whispered, the words catching in her throat. A change occurred. It was subtle. Ben's breathing, which had been a shallow, rhythmic puff, hitched. His head turned slowly, stiffly on the pillow. His glassy, unfocused eyes shifted from the ceiling and locked onto hers. A spark of hope, wild and irrational, flared in her chest. Ben! His lips parted. A thin line of drool escaped the corner of his mouth. He tried to form a word, his tongue a clumsy, dead thing. A soft, wet sound emerged. SSSSC? Ilera leaned closer, her heart hammering. See? See what, Ben? His hand twitched on the white sheet. His fingers, pale and limp, began to move. They weren't random spasms. They were tracing something. A pattern on the sterile cotton. His index finger slowly, deliberately drew a spiral, then a series of jagged lines radiating from its center, the symbol from the tree. A cold dread, colder than any mountain stream, washed through her. She recoiled from the bed. As she moved back, Ben's eyes changed. The vacancy was replaced by a sudden, shocking clarity. It was him again, the bright-eyed recruit, trapped behind a pane of terror. He looked directly at her, and the raw, unvarnished fear in his gaze was worse than the catatonia. It's not the trees, he whispered, his voice a brittle, broken thing. It's what grows between them. His eyes then rolled back into his head, and he fell back onto the pillow. The clarity extinguished as suddenly as it had appeared. The heart monitor blipped steadily on, oblivious. Ilera stumbled out of the room, out of the hospital, and into the parking lot. She leaned against her cruiser, gulping the fresh air, tried to erase the image of Ben's terrified, lucid moment and the symbol he had drawn. It's what grows between them. The drive back to the park was a nightmare of flashing images. She reported for duty on autopilot. Mackie had given her administrative tasks. Paperwork from the incident, inventory, anything to keep her off the trails and out of the woods. She was a liability now. A traumatized soldier benched after a firefight. But the park was her home, and her home had been violated. She couldn't sit in an office while the thing that had broken Ben was still out there. She needed to understand. She needed to see the place in the light of day. Ignoring Mackie's unspoken order, she geared up. She didn't take a radio. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. This was between her and the woods. The hike to the old logging cut was different in the daylight. The sun filtered to the canopy in bright, dappled shafts. Birds sang. It was beautiful, peaceful. It was a lie. The beauty felt like a mask, a pleasant fiction painted over a rotting, ancient truth. Every rustle in the underbrush made her jump. Every shadow seemed to hold a lingering, vertical malice. She found the spot with a chilling ease, as if an invisible string were pulling her toward it. She recognized a massive spruce tree first. The ground beneath it was scuffed and disturbed. This was where she had found Ben. Her eyes scanned the trunk, searching for the symbol he had drawn on the hospital sheets. There was nothing, just rough, gray bark. She reached out, her fingers tracing the place where it had been. The bark was smooth, unnaturally so. It felt polished, cold. She knelt, examining the forest floor. The earth was soft, and there, partly obscured by fallen needles, she saw it. Not a symbol, but an impression. A long, deep groove in the soil, as if something heavy and blunt had been dragged away from the tree and into the deeper woods. The scraping sound, against every instinct screaming at her to run. She followed the groove. It weaved between the trees, a sinister path stamped into the earth. It led her to a small, rocky clearing she had never seen before, a place not on any park map. The ground here was different, barren, covered in a brittle, gray lichen that cracked like bone under her boots. In the center of the clearing was a ring of stones, blackened by ancient fire. An old hearth, a campsite from a century ago, from a failed logging operation. And in the center of the ring, something was growing. It was a fungus, or something like it. A cluster of pale, fleshy stalks that thrust up from the charred earth. They were the color of a week-old corpse. At the top of each stalk was a bulbous, closed-capped. They stood perfectly still. They didn't sway in the gentle breeze. They were waiting. Ilera took a step closer, her breath catching in her throat. The air around the growth was utterly still and carried a faint, sweet smell of decay and ozone. It was a smell from the cellar in her nightmares, the smell that had hung around Ben in the hospital. This was it. This was what grew between the trees. As she stared, revolted and mesmerized, one of the bulbous caps began to tremble. Slowly, with a moist, tearing sound, it split open. It wasn't a mushroom cap. It was an eyelid, and from underneath it, a single black, sightless eye opened. It swiveled in its socket of pale flesh, not looking at the sky or the sun, but rotating downward until its glossy, dark lens was fixed directly on her. A wave of nausea and primal terror slammed into Ilera. She stumbled backward, tripping over a root and landing hard on the lichen-covered ground. The crack it made was like laughter. She scrambled to her feet, not daring to look back, and ran. She ran blindly, branches whipping at her face, her heart pounding a frantic drumbeat of flight. She didn't stop until she burst out onto the main trail, gasping for air, the bright sun feeling like a distant, indifferent star. She leaned against a trail marker, trying to steady her shaking hands. She had to tell someone. She had to tell Mackie. They needed to burn it, to purge that thing from the park. But as the initial panic subsided, a cold, rational thought took its place. Who would believe her? They'd committed to the story of Ben's accident, showing them a patch of weird mushrooms with eyes. They'd relieve her of duty for good. They'd think the trauma had broken her. 2. She was alone with this knowledge. She walked slowly back to the ranger station, her mind racing. She passed a trailhead kiosk, its map of the park now looking like a childish fantasy. The real map was written in symbols on trees and dragged through the dirt. As she approached her cruiser, something on the windshield caught her eye. Tucked under the wiper blade was a small, neat bouquet. It was made of dried pine needles, bound together with a strip of pale, fibrous bark. It was crude, yet meticulously crafted. A gift, or a warning. With a trembling hand, she reached out and picked it up. The needles were sharp and brittle, and as she held it, a single, definitive whisper brushed against her ear, as clear as if someone were standing right beside her. "We see you." Ilera dropped the bouquet as if it had burned her. She looked around wildly. The parking lot was empty. The woods were still. She fumbled with her keys, unlocked the cruiser, and slid inside, locking the doors behind her. She sat there for a long time, just breathing, trying to quiet the tremors that racked her body. She looked at her reflection in the rear-view mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a fear she knew would never truly leave her. And then her gaze drifted past her own reflection to the back seat. There, sitting upright and centered on the plastic bench, was a bouquet of pine needles. It hadn't fallen on the ground. It was inside the locked car with her. It had always been inside. What the woods keep. The pine needle bouquet sat on the passenger seat. Ilera didn't touch it. She didn't throw it out. It was a fact now, a part of her reality as undeniable as the steering wheel in her hands or the uniform on her back. It was a claimed state. You are seen. You are known. The days bled into a week, then two. A strange, tense normalcy descended. Ben was transferred to a long-term psychiatric facility. His family, pale and shattered, thanked Ilera for her bravery. The words were acid on her tongue. Ranger Mackey assigned her to the visitor center, a gilded cage of answering questions and selling maps to places she could no longer think of without a cold not forming in her stomach. She tried to forget. She tried to bury the memory of the fleshy stalk in its black, swiveling eye under a mountain of mundane paperwork and forced smiles. But the woods were always there, a green and brooding presence at the edge of every window, and the woods reminded her. It started with small things. She'd find a sprinkling of fresh pine needles on the driver's seat every morning, though her car was locked and untouched. The smell of damp earth and ozone would sometimes fill her apartment in the dead of night, waking her from nightmares of scraping sounds and whispering leaves, only to vanish when she turned on the light. Then the dreams began. Not nightmares of chase or terror, but something far worse. Dreams of profound, ancient silence. Dreams of roots digging deep into cold, dark soil, of sunlight felt only as a distant, dappled warmth on bark. They were dreams of being still and old and waiting. She would wake up feeling heavy, her limbs stiff, her thoughts moving with a slow, syrupy patience that was not her own. One afternoon, a call came in. A group of hikers was overdue from the Hemlock Valley Loop, a trail that skirted the edge of the old growth, not far from the Whispering Pines. Mackey was off-site. The other rangers were dealing with a bear incident on the east side. "I'll take it," Ilera heard herself say into the radio, her voice sounding calm, distant. There was a pause on the other end. "Ilera, are you sure? I can call Phil, have him double back." "I'm sure," she said, already grabbing her gear. "I'm the closest." It wasn't a lie, and a deeper, more unsettling truth was coiling in her gut. She wanted to go. The pull was a physical sensation, a magnetic tug in her chest, drawing her toward those specific trees. The fear was still there, a cold undercurrent, but was being steadily eclipsed by a terrifying sense of purpose. She drove to the trailhead, her movements automatic. The forest welcomed her. The sunlight seemed to fade, the sounds of birds and crickets softening into a respectful hush. She didn't need to call out for the hikers. She knew where they were. She turned off the main path onto a game trail she'd never consciously noticed before, her feet moving with surety that was not her own. She found them in a small clearing. A family, 2 parents and a young boy. They weren't lost. They were standing perfectly still, their faces slack with a vacant, dreamy peace. They were staring at a particularly large and ancient pine, its roots sprawling across the forest floor like great wooden serpents. They didn't startle when she approached. They simply turned their heads toward her in unison, their movements slow and synchronized. "Ranger," the father said, his voice a flat, emotionless monotone. The tree was whispering. It told us the most wonderful stories. Stories of the deep earth, of the long sleep. A cold dread, familiar yet now somehow distant, prickled at the back of Alara's neck. This was how it began. "The trail is this way," she said, her own voice sounding strangely resonant in the quiet glade. She didn't guide them. She simply turned, and they followed her, a silent, placid procession. She led them back to the main trail, and as they stepped onto the packed earth, they blinked, shaking their heads as if waking from a deep sleep. "Oh, Ranger, we must have taken a wrong turn," the mother said, her voice returning to its normal, flustered pitch. "We got completely turned around." Alara smiled. It felt like stretching a rubber mask over her face. "It happens. The trails can be confusing. Head straight this way. You'll be back at the parking lot in 20 minutes. She watched them go, the normal sounds of the forest returning as they disappeared from view. They would have a story about getting briefly lost. They would never remember the tree, or the whispers, or the profound peace. The woods had given them back, and it had used her to do it. She stood there for a long moment, then turned to look back into the deep green where she had found them. Between the trees, standing beside the ancient pine, was a thin figure. It was clearer now. She could see it was not made of wood or shadow, but of something else, a weaving of tendrils and moss and darkness given form. Its head was tilted. It didn't feel menacing. It felt expectant. A whisper brushed against her mind, not with words, but with an image, a map of the park. She saw a flicker of light on the map, a family wandering dangerously close to the old cut, to the clearing of the eye-shaped fungus. A warning. The entity wasn't just a predator. It was territorial. It was protective, and it had chosen her to be its warden. The realization should have horrified her. Instead, a deep, unsettling calm settled over her. The frantic, human fear that had been her constant companion since that first night simply evaporated. It was replaced by a colder, quieter certainty. This was her purpose now. This was the price for Ben's return, for her own survival. She was the gatekeeper. She returned to the station. Mackie was back, his eyes narrowing as she walked in. "The hikers?" he asked, his voice gruff. "Found them. A little turned around on the Hemlock Loop. I showed them the way back." Her report was flawless, delivered with a calm she didn't have to fake. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze searching for cracks, the trauma, the lingering fear. He found none. He saw only a capable ranger who had done her job. "Good," he said finally, though the word was laced with new wariness. He saw that she was whole. He just couldn't see what she was now full of. That night, Alara didn't dream of trees. She listened to them. She sat on the floor of her dark apartment, her back against the wall, and in the silence, she could hear it. A low, thrumming hum that was a network of roots beneath the town. A whisper on the wind that carried the scent of a campfire where there shouldn't be one. The faint, panicked thoughts of a deer that caught the scent of a mountain lion. The park was speaking to her. It was sharing its secrets. She got up and drove to the park, not to the station, but to a remote fire road. She got out and walked into the woods, not needing a light. The path was as clear to her as if it were noon. She went to the clearing with the stone ring. The fungal growth was larger. More stalks had emerged, their fleshy eyelids closed. The central stalk, the one with the open eye, was thicker. The black eye watched her approach, unblinking. She felt no fear, only a sense of reporting for duty. She knelt before it, placing her hand on the cold, lichen-covered earth. The images came faster, clearer. She saw a poacher's trap, well hidden near a stream. She saw a group of drunk teenagers planning to vandalize the petroglyphs on the south face. She saw a single, exhausted hiker, his ankle twisted, his hope fading as the temperature dropped. The woods were showing her its wounds, its threats. When she stood to leave, the whisper came again, not as a sound, but as a cold certainty planted in her mind. This is what we keep. This is what we protect. You are ours, and we are yours. Alara Vance drove back, to town as the sun began to rise. She passed a fellow ranger on patrol and gave a small, casual wave. He waved back. She looked normal. She was fine, but she wasn't. She stopped at the overlook where this had all begun, where she and Ben had watched the sunset a lifetime ago. She looked out over the endless sea of green, and the love she felt for was still there, but it was a possessive, terrifying love. It was no longer the love of a steward for a beautiful place. It was the love of a component for its machine, a cell for its body. A family's car was parked nearby, and they were getting out to take a picture, their laughter ringing in the morning air. The father stepped off the paved path, onto the fragile meadow grass to get a better angle. Without thinking, Ilara's head turned. Her voice, when she called out, was not her own. It was lower, raspier, carrying chill of deep shade and the absolute authority of something very old. Stay on the path. The man froze mid-step, his smile vanishing. He looked at her, and for a second his eyes widened not with recognition of a park ranger, but with a primal, unconscious fear. He quickly retreated to the pavement, gathered his family, and hurried back to their car. Ilara didn't watch them go. She was already looking back at the trees. The scent of pine sap, damp earth, and boundless space filled her lungs. It was the smell of home. It was the smell of her cell. And she knew, with a certainty that was as deep and unshakable as the roots of the oldest pine, that Ranger Ilara Vance would never truly leave these woods again. She had been found. She had been given a purpose. And the woods, as they always did, had decided what to keep